So the refugee, persecuted and threatened with extermination, will be condemned to walk day and night. Pretty heavy stuff, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
Those words, they really hit you right in the gut. And there's how Théophile Ruhorahoza, he starts his memoir. The book we're going to dig into today is called the Mbandaka Endpoint. It's all about escaping from, well, he calls them the last killing fields of Rwandan refugees in Congo back in May 1997.
It's an intense read, that's for sure.
Intense, putting it mildly. But it's important, right? We're talking about a firsthand perspective on something truly awful. What Ruhorahoza went through, what all those refugees went through, it's not something we can just gloss over.
Absolutely. And Ruhorahoza, he doesn't hold back. He gives you this, like, visceral, you were there account of what it was like to be hunted, to be starving, to see people you know just gone.
So for this deep dives, we're going to try to follow Ruhorahoza's journey as best we can. From when he first had to run from Rwanda through all the dangers he faced, all the way to, hopefully, finding some kind of safety in Congo-Brazzaville.
Sounds like a plan. Along the way, we'll see how the rest of the world reacted, or in a lot of cases, didn't react.
Yeah, the whole international response, or lack thereof, that's a huge part of the story.
It really is. To understand where Ruhorahoza is coming from, we got to remember the Rwandan Genocide back in '94. We're talking hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered, mostly Tutsis, right?
Right. And Ruhorahoza makes it clear that the violence didn't just stop there. I mean, most of the refugees who were later massacred in Zaire, where Ruhorahoza ends up, they were Hutus, and there were some Burundian refugees, too.
That's a key point.
It is, because by that point, a lot of international organizations, even the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, they had already pulled out.
And Ruhorahoza lays out exactly what happened in those massacres. I mean, we're talking about shelling, knives, torture, rape. People were starving, diseases were running rampant, and nobody was really doing anything to get aid to them.
Organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they backed up all of this in their own reports, too. It was bad.
And some pretty high-profile people were using some strong language about it. Ruhorahoza mentions Boutros Ghali and Kofi Annan both described it as a creeping genocide, a war on terror.
Roberto Garriton, in his reports, he went even further and classified the massacres as potential crimes against humanity or even genocide.
And this was all happening while Ruhorahoza was right in the thick of it. He saw it all firsthand.
Like he says in the intro to his book, he couldn't stay silent. He felt like he had to get this story out.
So his book starts with those attacks on the refugee camps in the summer of '96 and follows the refugees' flight until the first ones made it to safety in Congo-Brazzaville in May '97. Ruhorahoza himself, he was part of that exodus. He first ran from Gikongoro to Siangu, then crossed the Rusizi Bridge into Zaire, and eventually ended up in Bukavu. It was complete chaos, people everywhere, all trying to get away from the same thing.
From there, Ruhorahoza went to the Kashusha refugee camp, which was near Kavumu Airport. That's where he got help from the Red Cross. You know, it's interesting. Even in the middle of all this chaos, he describes people trying to create some kind of order, some kind of community.
Yeah, like little pockets of normalcy in this sea of crazy. I mean, Ruhorahoza even organized volleyball tournaments and started teaching in the camp.
He actually taught Latin and philosophy at a camp called ADI Kivu. Can you imagine?
Talk about making the best of a terrible situation. But of course it didn't last. The Kashusha camp was attacked in November of '96, and everything fell apart.
Ruhorahoza describes this mad scramble for safety into Kahuzi-Biega National Park. People lost everything, the little bit they'd managed to hold on to.
It was back to square one. And then came the forest. Thick, dense, and full of dangers. You can practically feel Ruhorahoza's fear and exhaustion as he writes about trekking through it. No food, wild animals everywhere, constantly under threat of attack.
And all sense of structure just poof, gone.
Yeah.
He talks about how in Luanda it was every refugee for themselves. The leaders, the soldiers, they'd all taken off with the exiled Rwandan government.
But even in that chaos, Ruhorahoza found people who helped him. He joined the small group, they made decisions together, scavenged for food. There's this one part where they find some ripe bananas, and it's like this huge moment of relief.
It's almost like you forget how basic survival is until you read something like that.
Exactly. And you see that contrast all through Ruhorahoza's story. Like there's this part where he goes back to help another journalist, a guy named Ujud. It's this act of incredible courage and solidarity.
But it almost gets them both killed. They're attacked in Luanda and they have to run again.
Yeah, it's like one step forward, two steps back.
Yeah.
And then you have someone like Beatrice Umutesi, who is the president of a whole group of NGOs, and even she's reduced to begging for help with a toothache.
It shows you how bad things were. No doctors, no dentists, just basic survival. Some refugees, they got so desperate they tried to make it to Zambia. Ruhorahoza describes them going through these thick Barega forests, wading through water for days.
That attempt to reach Zambia, it failed. They had to turn back. And then they hit the Hombo Bridge where Mobutu's soldiers were waiting.
It was one obstacle after another. But they got past the soldiers, and they kept going, even though the RPF soldiers were right on their tail.
The threat of violence was always there. And then came Tebero, where they started finding the bodies. Ruhorahoza talks to two women, Christine and Vestine, who saw it all. The killings, the remains in palm oil.
It was systematic. Christine couldn't even bury her own sister. Vestine said armed men were deliberately targeting the refugees.
And Ruhorahoza, when he got to Tebero, he recognized the body of someone he knew. Just heartbreaking. He mentions another guy, Manasseh, who lost a sister there.
And the whole time, they're hearing stories from other survivors, more massacres, more killings. It was like this horrible wave washing over everything.
And they had to keep moving ahead of the game, as Ruhorahoza calls it, towards Walikale and Tingi Tingi, which, wasn't exactly a safe haven either.
We got to talk about Emma Bonino here. She was the European Commissioner for Humanitarian Action at the time, and she visited Tingi Tingi. Ruhorahoza makes a big deal out of that visit.
Yeah, it was a big deal. She saw what was happening, and she was horrified. She tried to get the world to pay attention.
But then you have Sadako Ogata, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, who came in with a totally different perspective.
Right. Ogata, she saw Tingi Tingi as this camp controlled by ex-soldiers who were holding other refugees hostage. She said the UN should only help the ones who were willing to go back to Rwanda.
Ruhorahoza contrasts Bonino's compassion with Ogata's more political view. And then, to make things even worse, the RPF attacked while Ogata was there. A lot of the refugees, Ruhorahoza included, they saw it as a warning.
And then, not long after that, the Amisi and Tingi Tingi camps were destroyed. Total chaos again. Ruhorahoza describes these explosions, everyone running, not knowing where to go.
There was this whole thing about the planes at Tingi Tingi, too. Rumors about whether they were bringing aid or more attacks.
And then a plane actually crashed into a refugee woman. It's like every direction you turn, there's another danger.
After Tingi Tingi, Ruhorahoza's group tried to make their way to Kisangani, but they had to change course when they heard the Ugandan army was there. That's what led them to the Lualaba River.
The Lualaba, that was a tough one. To cross it, they had to give up what little they had left. Ruhorahoza actually traded his trousers for a spot on a pirogue. Talk about desperate.
You really get a sense of how dangerous that river crossing was. Ruhorahoza writes about losing faith in everything, even God, when he was out there on the water.
And on the banks of the Ubundu Railway, you have couples deciding to split up, thinking it'll give them a better chance of surviving. Husbands and wives saying goodbye, maybe forever.
Ruhorahoza also talks about people like Benoit Rugumaho, who lost his child, and Alfred Habinshuti, who died after Tingi Tingi. Just loss after loss after loss.
And the Maniema region, that was rough too. Hostile locals, armed groups everywhere. Ruhorahoza says he started to hate the Lingala language because of all the threats and insults he heard in it.
But there were also some good people there. People who offered food and shelter, who acted with real compassion.
True. But you have to remember, there were so many refugees, it was putting a strain on even the most generous communities. Then Kisangani fell in March of '97. More uncertainty, more fear. Ruhorahoza talks about this unguarded barrier, these unspoken rules to stay silent, to get rid of any documents that could link them to Rwanda.
They were trying to erase their identities, hoping to avoid detection. The fear was constant, and there was no way to communicate easily. Information was spread by word of mouth, which meant a lot of people were caught off guard.
And then they found the rice zone, and for a little while, at least, they had food. Ruhorahoza talks about how much work it was to prepare the rice, but it was sustenance.
And on the way to Buende, there was some meat, but not much, and not for everyone. The people who arrived last, they missed out, and people kept dying from exhaustion and hunger. It was a brutal existence.
Ruhorahoza describes how some locals, even though they didn't have much themselves, they shared what they could. He even ate snails and caterpillars just to survive. He'd never have imagined doing that before.
But it's like the forest, the whole experience. It forced people to depend on each other, to share what little they had. The elderly, the sick, the disabled, they got priority for food, especially the meat.
Makes sense. They were the most vulnerable. Then, as they were getting close to Buende, a Zairean man, he said he was a pastor, he warned them to run, that the RPF was coming.
It's scary to think what might have happened if he hadn't done that.
Yeah, but even with the warning, things didn't get much better. When they got to the Equator region, Some of the locals started killing the refugees.
Out of fear, mostly. They'd heard all these stories. They were terrified. Ruhorahoza talks about being forced to go through to Injende, and then his friend Charles got really sick.
They had to leave Charles behind. They had no choice. They couldn't carry him, and staying meant risking their own lives. It was a terrible decision to have to make.
When they finally got to Injandi, the Zairian soldiers there, they weren't any better.
They had to use all their wits to get across the river there, and then they started hearing about the massacres that had already happened in Boende and Njende.
Ruhorahoza talks to a nun, Sister Annie, who describes mass graves, bodies burned by the side of the road, people thrown alive into the river. Just horrific.
And the survivors from those massacres, they all headed to Mbandaka hoping maybe there'd be international protection there, or they could get across to Congo-Brazzaville.
But there was no food in Mbandaka. People were desperate. Ruhorahoza talks about this one woman who was breastfeeding her child when she got bitten by a snake and died. It's like death was all around them in every form you can imagine.
They kept going, though. They had to. Next stop was Wenji Sekli. They were hoping the Zairian soldiers there would be different, more humane.
But they weren't. They were just as brutal, disarming the refugees, especially anyone who looked like they might have been part of the former Rwandan army.
And Wenji Sekli, that was where it all really went to hell. It was crowded right by the Congo River, nowhere to go. And then the RPF showed up.
The White Fathers and the Red Cross, they were there trying to help, but it was too much, too fast. Ruhorahoza describes the gunfire, the panic, everyone scattering, trying to escape.
He was sick himself, bloody diarrhea, thought he was going to die. He ran into a former student, Dr. Sixbert, in the middle of all that, a brief moment of connection, and then gone.
Ruhorahoza talks about trying to treat his illness, but there was no medicine, so he was relying on traditional remedies, whatever he could find. It wasn't working.
The night of May 9th, that was the turning point. The gunfire got really intense, and it became clear that Mbandaka had probably fallen. The gendarmerie, they'd disarmed everyone, so the refugees were completely defenseless.
After the massacre, Ruhorahoza describes Wenji Sekli as this sea of blood, the blood flowing right into the Congo River. It's this really powerful image, like nature itself was bearing witness to the horror.
And Mbandaka was next. Ruhorahoza tells this story of a Rwandan family who saw the whole thing, how the RPF took the town, how they killed everyone. It was calculated, methodical, just like in Wenji Sekli.
Ruhorahoza, he was on his own by then, paddling this tiny canoe, just following the faint trail of other refugees. He found a little abandoned shelter, and he was so weak he could barely move. He ran into another former student, Emmanuel, who somehow recognized him even though he was so sick.
And Ruhorahoza says he lost his voice around this time. He describes it as feeling like the beginning of death.
It's like he was fading away. But then something changed. The locals, they started to realize how bad it was, and they started helping the refugees get across the river.
Of course, some of them were still trying to profit from it, charging exorbitant prices for passage on these rickety pirogues. But others showed real kindness. Ruhorahoza talks about this one family that gave him their own sheeting so he could get across. Amazing.
He was holding his rosary the whole time. Faith was all he had left. He finally made it to Mobenzano, but even there, people were discriminating against them, seeing them as poor and desperate.
Luckily, the village elders stepped in and helped them move on. They were probably superstitious, afraid of what would happen if they didn't help.
Whatever their reasons, it worked. Ruhorahoza eventually made it to Njondu in Congo-Brazzaville. He was picked up by the police, which in this case was actually a good thing.
He was safe finally, or at least safer. He was still sick, though, and it took a while for him to get any real help. He eventually reunited with Dr. Sixbert and got some medical care.
But then he met this guy named Milton, who talked about forced repatriation, and the fear came rushing back. He even started thinking about escaping again, and the way aid was being distributed, it was dehumanizing. Ruhorahoza talks about biscuits being handed out based on the size of your wristband. It's like they weren't even seen as people.
It's crazy.
Well,
But Ruhorahoza, he never gave up. He got help from Camille's wife and Elias, and slowly he started to recover.
but the rumors were still flying. People were saying the RPF was in Brazzaville now, and then the civil war in Congo started, so there was this whole other layer of danger and uncertainty.
That's when the Ofanda family took him in. That was a huge turning point for him. They gave him a home, a family, a sense of belonging. They protected him too. Ruhorahoza tells this story about an incident at the market and how the mayor intervened because he was part of the Ofanda family.
It's like he finally found a place where he could breathe again.
He did, but even then, death was still a constant presence. He talks about how refugees kept dying from illness, from accidents, from the trauma of everything they'd been through.
It's like the past was always there, haunting them.
Exactly. And in the last part of the book, Ruhorahoza really lays into the RPA and the massacres they carried out. He talks about Bomino and Ogata again, how different their responses were. He praises Bonino for her compassion and criticizes Ogata for being too political, too skeptical.
He blames Ogata, at least in part, for the lack of protection for the refugees. And he keeps coming back to the destruction of Tingi Tingi, how devastating that was.
Ruhorahoza also calls for the truth about President Habyarimana's assassination to come out. He sees that as the spark that ignited everything, and he wants those responsible to be held accountable. Same thing for the murder of Bishop Munzihirwa Christoph.
Justice and accountability, those are the big things for him. He believes that's the only way Rwanda can ever truly heal.
He does, but he's not sure it'll ever happen. He ends the book with this question: how long can the world ignore what happened?
It's a heavy question. And he dedicates his book to the Ofanda family and to all who understood that the suffering man is more important than the suffering of man.
Powerful stuff. So let's try to wrap our heads around all this. We followed Ruhorahoza from Rwanda, through the camps, Kashusha, Tingi Tingi, witnessed the massacres in Wenji-Sekli and in Mbandaka. He crossed all these rivers, the Rusizi, the Lualaba, the Likwala Oerb, just to reach some semblance of safety in Congo-Brazzaville. What a journey.
It's almost impossible to comprehend. But that's what we're trying to do here, right? To understand what these refugees went through.
Exactly. And what Ruhorahoza's story shows us is the sheer will to survive, even when everything is stacked against you. But it also shows us the devastating consequences of violence, the loss of life, the way the world turns a blind eye.
And how people can be both incredibly cruel and incredibly kind, sometimes in the same breath. We saw that with the locals, how some of them were hostile and others were willing to risk their own lives to help.
And then you have the international community, the UN, Emma Bonino, Sadako Ogata, all playing their parts for better or for worse. And hanging over all of this are these accusations of creeping genocide and crimes against humanity. Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they weren't mincing words.
But in the end, what Ruhorahoza brings us back to is the individual human being, the suffering man. That's what his dedication is all about.
It is. So thinking about all of this, about everything Ruhorahoza went through, about the calls for truth and reconciliation, what does it mean to truly bear witness to this kind of suffering? What is our responsibility to understand these events, to make sure they're never forgotten?
And what does Ruhorahoza's story tell us about humanity itself, about our capacity for both incredible good and unimaginable evil?
That's what I want you to think about. It's a question we all need to grapple with.